1,000 illustrated postcards neatly organized in albums, and 84 posters represented fascinating primary sources that could contribute a novel historical record and unique perspective, and could be of interest to lots of different people. They believed us, trusted us, guided us, and provided the unique and unparalleled environment that encourages responsible exploration and which values innovation. The Blavatnik Family Foundation has enabled everything we do since, supporting our growing collections in modern Jewish culture, World Wars I and II, and Soviet history, and making nearly 19,000 items currently accessible on our website. They've given me the best job in the world. I am so deeply grateful. Referring to 20 years ago, when I say we, there were two, Aaron Kreisworth and myself. Aaron, the archive's creative director, translated our imagination about how to present and share the holdings from the beginning, evolving with our growing collections. He creates inspiring, stunning physical and digital displays. Your work never ceases to amaze. We have worked side by side from the very beginning on every idea. I continue to admire your work, and I'm so grateful for the partnership. I can't see, so he's somewhere here. There he is. Okay. I have to go like this and like this. Okay. It's very difficult. Leonid Reines, not in this room, hopefully on YouTube, joined in 2006 to work on the Veteran Project. Since, he personally interviewed more than 900 veterans, has transcribed tens of thousands of pages of interviews and documents, entered tens of thousands of data fields, and provides his insights. The Veteran Project, one of our most important projects that we have, would not be possible without his contribution. I am grateful. Olga Greco, the archive's editor, began working with the archive, I'm not counting the years anymore. Your brilliant editorial guidance and unwavering insistence on accuracy and information integrity ensure that the archive is trustworthy, which is imperative under any circumstance, and we can say especially now. Thank you. Brandon Schechter, the archive's historian, enriches our understanding of the collections every day. I truly learn every day, and moreover now shares interpretations and insights with our growing audience. It is an honor to work with you. Natalia Smotrov, who no matter what challenges rise and how many unplanned things pop up, makes sure operations are in order, logistics are always managed, and new challenges are never a problem. Thank you so much. I know you think I'm done, but that's just the daily we. It takes a village. I look at this room. Michelle Tochi, I don't know if you're not here, but if you are here, with the David Berg Foundation, the first outside funder who supported the archives program with our exhibit at the 92nd Street Y, and has continued to do so over the years. In this room and remotely, archivists, catalogers, scholars who have been working with our materials to make accessible for everyone else. Vasily Shidrin, Jan Mann, Olga Kucherenko, Anya Free. Professor Tzvi Gittelman was the first scholar I called for advice so many years ago. It was a cold call, which he not only took, but as an eminent scholar, took the time to guide me without judgment and has participated in our work ever since. We exploit all family members, and we are so fortunate that there's some good ones to exploit. Martin Kreisworth, who helped organize the fellowship program. Kenny Kreisworth, who assists with collateral designs. Deborah Hillard, who's working on social media production. And once you were a member of the team, long after you left, you are integral to our village. Olga Doyle, thank you for being here. Anna Shevel, you as well. Our institutional partners are here. Center for Jewish History, American Jewish Historical Society, 92nd Street Y, trusted vendors who turned into partners many years ago. Conwar Nasir, an IT comrade, who build and maintain our digital infrastructure. Michael Glickman and Jamies, who consult us on raising awareness for the archive. Peter Grisafi and Picture, who work with us on digitization. Our backbone is at Access Industries. Peter Turan, Frank Kambitzes, our friends from Access who have been by our side since the beginning. We would not be standing here without you. Thank you so much. And finally, I promise. My family, Max, Sam, Sophie, thank you so much for being here. It means so much. Sasha, thank you for always standing by my side. Wow, I'm surprising myself. Didn't expect that. We launched our anniversary program with fascinating guest speakers, scholars who reveal the complicated stories where our holdings come from, their intentions, and dig deep into their meanings. I know that firsthand because we've had the honor to work closely with each and have been fortunate to learn so much from them so directly. They represent incredible universities from across the country, as well as our very good friends in Canada. Thank you so much for being here. We're thrilled to be able to be together with all of you this evening in this wonderful and special building. John, thank you for hosting us, to hear their fascinating insights. I am so grateful to each of you for presenting tonight. Thank you. I hope you enjoy. I turn it over to Brandon Schechter to introduce the talks.
All right. Well, let me begin by just thanking everyone for coming tonight, and it's an honor and a privilege to both be part of this archive and to inaugurate our 20th anniversary program. In putting together this program, we wanted to highlight scholars who work with our collections and excel at communicating not only to an expert audience, but also to an intelligent public, the two groups who basically make up this room. We're very happy to be able to present this program, which focuses on some of the archive's striking visuals, which I remind you can be perused at any time on our site. So please allow me to introduce our distinguished panelists. I will basically be jumping in between each talk to introduce our folks. So allow me to introduce Dr. Samuel Driver, who is a scholar of Soviet and post-Soviet visual culture, whose research examines the intersection of photography, truth, and identity formation. He completed his PhD in Slavic Studies at Brown University in 2024, receiving the Dr. Pranas A. Svikauskas Dissertation Award, and currently serves as visiting assistant professor of Russian at Dickinson College. Samuel has held numerous prestigious fellowships, including the Fulbright Hays Doctoral Dissertation Research Abroad Fellowship, a position as a visiting scholar at Charles University in Prague, the Open Society Archives in Budapest, the Museum of Modern Art in Thessaloniki, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, among others. As an executive committee member in the European Leadership Network's Younger Generation Leaders Network on Euro-Atlantic Security, he bridges academic research on visual disinformation with policy engagement, something that is unfortunately all too relevant right now. Beyond his scholarly work, Samuel is a Russian-English translator of both poetry and nonfiction and maintains an active career as a professional musician. I turn things over to Dr. Driver.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Sorry while I get this laptop set up. Yes. Oh. Oh. There we go. The first thing that I wanted to say is that it's such a pleasure to be here tonight, and I cannot thank the Blavatnik Archive and the entire team more for the opportunity to explore their holdings and to build such a strong relationship over the past few years. I actually began this journey as a Blavatnik Archive fellow when I spent many hours combing through the collection and building a bit of what you'll see today. So, based on the short introduction and the very generous introduction that Brandon gave me, the clear through line in my work, of course, is the image. The way it can affect us, who we are at the most foundational level, and the immense amount of meaning with which we provide it. And this brings us to my talk today, entitled Traces in the Photo Archive. The approximately 27,000 photographs in the Blavatnik Archive provide a truly singular window into both the individual and collective histories and impersonal engagements with photography outside of the strictly official. Through the Blavatnik Archive's impressive holdings, I was afforded the opportunity to uncover a variety of deeply intimate and personal dimensions of photographic practice. After examining thousands upon thousands of images, I began to identify patterns and anomalies within the photo archive, especially eventually hand-selecting 966 images, creating my own subjective archive of the Blavatnik holdings. During my research, several distinct categories emerged, each connected to the others by a through line of what I designated as, quote, the trace. The first concerns physical traces of presence, and the second, serving as a foil to the first, relates to physical traces of absence. Although these two turn out to be far harder to delineate than one might first expect. The third and arguably most elusive can be characterized as digital traces, artifacts, arising from the intersection of preservation, technology, and the archive. And finally, there are future traces. Those traces prefiguring later explorations by Soviet nonconformist artists from the 1960s onwards, particularly those of the Ukrainian nonconformist photographer Boris Mikhailov. It is these categories, these forms of trace, that we're going to discuss today. Maybe. There we go. So the first is physical traces of presence. Some physical traces tell stories of remembrance, wartime violence, family history, or political transformation. In this first photo of a young Sofia Budova from 1931, we find the presence of her photographer through striking darkroom techniques, with the stripes of her dress peeking through the stylized, painterly swirls at the bottom of the photograph. On the verso, we find a personal note that the photo itself was a souvenir. In a striking portrait taken after his hospitalization, Yefim Golbrach locks eyes with the camera. While wear and damage might be expected as he carried this photo from the southern front, the trace left on the image is in fact not from travel or neglect, but instead due to a shell fragment that struck the photograph as it rested in his breast pocket. On the right, we find a wartime photograph of Ilya Kurganovich, worn down to a ghostly impression of the sitter with traces of text from paper the photograph was likely kept with. Another photograph here on the left is that of Arnold Fabrikant's mother, Branislava, and carries its own testimony. Quote, translated. The photograph that went through this photograph that went through the entire war, stormed heights, cities, villages, landed in amphibious operations, frozen trenches, lay in hospitals. Odessa, July 13th, 1941. The second photograph of Boris Komsky and 3 of his fellow soldiers in Eastern Prussia was taken in February of 1945. Well, the third is that of younger Dmitry Kamyshin, which was taken in 1937. His mother sent this to him as a part of a card, and the inscription says on the front, "Now you are 5 years older." And on the verso is her letter letting him know the day after Kiev had been liberated from the Nazis, begging for him to write back and let her know that he was safe. In these final portraits, we have other examples of physical intervention, with the figures outlined in thick yet chipping paint. On the left, we have the black and white photograph of Maria Raksina, taken in Kharkiv in 1932. And on the right, we have a photo of Georgy Konviser from the Bryansk front in 1943. These last 3 in particular will be worth thinking about when we arrive at the final category of traces, future traces. In these photographs, we find entire histories, traces of movement through time and space in both physical and image. There we go. Physical traces of absence. Some absences are left unexplained due to the ephemeral nature of the print, such as the torn print of Ida Mirskaya from 1944. Other traces represent various forms of absences, ranging from life and resources to memory. On the right, we have a photo of Gosset actor Benjamin Zuskin appearing at Solomon Mikhail's memorial service in Moscow on January 16th, 1948. All 14 photographs taken during the service were severely damaged by fire, as we can see on the right. maybe. Yeah, okay, perfect. Here we find the interplay on this slide between the photographed one person's memory and the need to rectify the loss of memory or knowledge of loved ones, particularly in relation to future generations. On the left, we have Vladimir Sats, circled with students of a 5th grade group, Group A, at school number 25 in Kiev. In the middle, we find Baruch Tzodikov with fellow employees of the military conscription service in 1944. You can see the box around his head sitting on the bottom left. And then finally, we have an arrow pointing to Isaac Tsodikovich. It's the first row in the center, who is a part of the Superior Armament Development Team. So as we can see, we both have the presence of memory as well as the attempt to preserve what may have already been lost. These physical absences often intertwine with textual traces, exemplified in Hanan Babayev's account of her brother Zakhar, who disappeared, quote, without a trace in 1943, only to later return and face conviction as a former POW in 1946. We find the honoring of absence and the documentation of these those missing with the following two. In the middle, we find participants of the anniversary of the 1941 parade in Moscow. And on the bottom right, we find a set of pictures of administrators, instructors, and students of the theatrical studio of the Moscow State Yiddish Theater who graduated in May 1937. This meaningfully and importantly is a photocopy of the older original. Some traces are linked to broader political histories, and this was actually quite fascinating when I found this one on the right, because this was a large part of my dissertation working on Stalinist photo manipulation. So as we see on the right-hand side, which is held in the Blavatnik's holdings, a photograph of Lenin addressing soldiers before the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow on May 5th, 1920, including Trotsky and Kamenev. And we can see on the left-hand side figures both Trotsky and Kamenev physically removed from later iterations of the image as famously documented in the David King collection that is now held at the Tate. Other absences lend darker narratives, as in the following photograph from the Kokuch's family collection. This on the right is from a set of photographs documenting scenes from Auschwitz-Birkenau, made shortly after the Red Army liberated the concentration camp. On the left-hand side, we have a photograph left by Isaac Tendler, which raises more questions than gives answers, as it intertwines what seems to be a mix between childish scribbles over faces with a seemingly deliberate alteration with the cut down the middle. On this slide, we have another presence of absence. The photo on the far left is taken in the middle. The photo was taken in one of the storage facilities of the Hermitage during the Leningrad blockade. On the far left, we have residents gathering water also during the blockade from an artillery shell crater in the pavement of Nevsky Prospekt, a makeshift well that speaks both to wartime deprivation and desperation. On the far right, the Blavatnik Archive has a collection of photos by Louis Fox, and we can see in the writing above the photo, he has handwritten notes that accompany each of the photographs, and this was Vir, highlighting how both the photographs both preserve and complicate memory. Okay. And then finally, we have a stereo view of pre-revolutionary Pidrogov. So we can see this stereo view both as a tool of exploration as well as a visual reminder of what has been left in the past. This part is actually, I think, one of the most interesting for me when I was going through the archive. So some traces exist solely within Blavatnik's online archive. Digital artifacts and anomalies absent from both the original photographs as well as the scans, highlighting the nature of this new type of archival system. These digital traces, seen through distorted colors and image slicing reminiscent of montage, reveal the hybrid nature of contemporary archives, where the physical and digital methods of preservation intersect. This intersection, as demonstrated in the images below, or I guess above, has the potential to generate new and quite unexpected meanings. And finally, how am I doing on time? Good. And finally, we get to future traces. So significantly, certain photographic traces documented in the archive that we've seen up to this point prefigure later developments in Soviet unofficial underground photography. The widespread use of collage, hand painting, vignetting, among other formal techniques throughout the collection anticipates later conceptual and formal approaches implied by Soviet nonconformist artists like Boris Mikhailov, Vadim Zakharov, Vladimir Kuprianov, and Ilya Kabakov, among others. And in particular, the practice of luriki, which is the essentially the blowing up of a black and white image and using aniline dyes in order to color it. There we go. And these are some of the other images from the archive's holdings, showing the dyes that are being used in order to essentially accent the different parts of the photo. We can see this here again. On the left is Tatiana Korkina, and then on the right is a colorized portrait of Tatiana Plis. There we go. This is, I wanted to bring this together. This is Vadim Zakharov, and it's I've Acquired Enemies from 1982, showing the breakdown essentially between text being on the photograph, being under the photograph, a part of it, and now become a part of the body as well. Then here we have three more photos from Boris Mikhailov. On the left we have, or on the right, let's say, we have a photo from his series Vicinity, and I want to really quickly, keeping this in mind, see if I can guide us back. Maybe not. Oh. Sorry. One more. Two more. And one more back. There we go. The photo that was sent to the Sun after the Nazis were taken out of Kiev. Sorry, if we can go back to the where we were before. Okay. And then very quickly, I could talk about this all day, but we'll have a little bit of time later. Lastly, I wanted to bring in Ilya Kabakov and his, I guess, yeah, okay, we can see the Labyrinth, My Mother's Album from 1990, which is photographs and texts cut out from postcards, which are hung in frames without glass and pasted on wallpapers along one side of an entire length of the corridor, approximately 50 meters in length. The photographs were taken by Yuri Blecher, his uncle, a professional photographer, and they depict views of the city of Berdyansk, while the text of the series, around 75 pages, was the text of his mother's memoirs. And thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you so much, Samuel. It is now my honor to introduce Alison Rowley, who is the chair of the Department of History at Concordia University, Montreal. She received her PhD in 2000 from Duke University after completing a dissertation that looked at the role of women in Soviet visual propaganda in the 1930s. Since then, she has gone on to write 2 books, Open Letters, Russian Popular Culture and the Picture Postcard, 1880 to 1922, and Putin Kish in America, which is really just this incredible archive in and of itself of all of the weird Putin stuff that was sold in America, mostly after 2016, 2017. Her current work examines Russian history from 1880 to 1939 through an ephemeral lens, and her talk is Soviet Lottery Tickets of the 1930s, Ephemera, Propaganda, and the Blavatnik Archive. Alison.
Okay, so they said I'm supposed to use this clicker. We'll see how that goes. And I'm supposed to carry this because I'm categorically incapable of standing behind a podium. We'll try. All right, there we go. Thank you very much to everybody from the Blavatnik Archive for inviting me to be part of this. And in many ways, what I'm going to talk to you about today is not who I am now. It's who I once was, but every time I look at these images, I am reminded of that young scholar and why I fell in love with those items. So I hope to share some of that with you this evening. I also feel kind of weird because I'm presenting after Sam's very serious talk, and he's working with these wonderful objects that have such profound significance to individuals. And I'm going to talk to you about lottery tickets. But there is a reason there, and they did ask online for us to give more space here. That was on the same line. I didn't screw that up. But anyway, this is one of those lottery tickets that I used to collect, and I will explain where this comes from. When I began studying Soviet visual propaganda, the field at that time, people began to look at the visual materials, but they were doing it medium by medium. And so we had a book on posters, we had a book on film, we had a book on this. And I kept thinking, why are they in a vacuum? Because when I started to look, what I saw was the interconnectedness. Now, can someone at the back show, do you really want me to use the clicker? Because I'm technologically illiterate here, people. Oh, look at that, it worked. So, all right. What I saw was a multi-pronged world, and essentially the whole basis of all of the things I collected, and I was really lucky because I was doing this more years ago than I want to remember, but when eBay was really young. So PayPal didn't exist, nobody bought anything, nobody knew what they had, and I got paid enormous amounts of money to sit at a desk and be bored so I could do this. And I started just looking to ask this question. If you lived in the Soviet Union in the late 1920s and in the 1930s, could you avoid Soviet propaganda? So I was fascinated by this idea, right, about pervasiveness. And I wanted to know the ways in which campaigns interacted with one another. And what that led me to was ordinary objects. So we're not talking about the things that decorated the walls in a museum or in a public place. I wanted to know, in your daily life, what did you come into contact with? And tonight, when they were asking what would you like to talk about, I could have chosen things like the envelopes, because the back of the envelopes had slogans on them. There's any number of things I could have talked about. I picked the lottery tickets because they're beautiful, and they're tiny. So why invest in something so small and make them beautiful? And it's the messages that they conveyed about the changing nature of Soviet society, the ideas about modernity, about the promises about consumption. Most of the ones I've chosen don't have a gendered message, but a lot of the other things I worked with did as well. So this is a sampling of some of the lottery tickets. And so you have 3 lottery tickets, that one, and that one. We'll talk about the organizations in a minute when we focus in one-on-one. But I also slipped in this other postcard, because what it is, it's a postcard advertising the sale of lottery tickets. And I think that really speaks to that interconnectedness. Because when these tickets went on sale and the lotteries were held, the campaigns would be advertised in women's magazines and in the newspapers. And you really couldn't avoid this, okay? And they're wonderfully detailed visuals, all smaller than your phone. Some of the later ones that you'll see tonight are about the size of your phone. And so these are very powerful pieces of propaganda. And I mean, my joy in all of this too is that they found a home. And as my career path changed, in part owing to two people named Christopher and Benjamin, who I guarantee you are not watching the live YouTube screen on this because you have no interest in what it is that I do. They're in their 20s. They're interested in other things. But as my career path changed, I wondered what I was going to do with all of this stuff. And then I met Julie. And they have found a home. And what's more, they found a home, and this is why the Blavatnik Archive part is in the title, is they found a home that made these available to other people. And so scholars around the world can use them. Students can reproduce any of the crazy stuff I collected in their work, free of charge, no firewalls. This is an amazing resource. And to make this available for scholars, like when we were doing this at the original thing years ago, it was already a big deal. Now in today's world where it's so difficult to go into Eastern Europe and into the archives, and there are whole countries one shouldn't go to, this is invaluable. This is the next generation of scholarship. And they're going to use these collections. So these are some of the cards. And it shows you propaganda as, I swear, all the boxes were perfectly lined up, but always the technical. These are just part of everyday life. So if you can flip to the next slide, we're going to talk about voluntary societies in a minute. Okay, so one of the interesting things about this is there's two different kinds of lotteries in the Soviet context. You do have state-sponsored lotteries where the tickets are for sale through your workplace, and the purchase is by and large mandatory. All right? So you're in a meeting like this, someone like me stands up and says, we're all going to contribute, you all agree this is an important campaign, and we expect you to turn over X% of your paycheck to get these tickets. And everyone has to agree because otherwise you're going to be in trouble. Those are not the tickets I'm going to talk to you about tonight. I'm going to talk to you about the tickets that were voluntary societies, where these are other organizations that are trying to raise money, and yet they are still promoting this vision of Soviet modernity. And two societies in particular stand out here, all right? So the first one is Avtodor, right here. And this is a gorgeous stick. Oh, this is such a beautiful piece. And I call it On the Road to Socialism because they literally mean on the road. This is a society that promotes the spread of skills about driving, as well as construction of roads, and driving as a sport. So they host all kinds of road races and rallies and all of this kind of stuff at the same time. So Avtodor, as you can see from the slide, was founded in 1927, and it lasted through 1935. And it did have some international connections, so some of the rallies, people would have participated beyond the confines of the Soviet Union, and other people came into the Soviet Union as well. It received no funding from the government, so the lottery was the source of money. And that's why they were doing it. The tickets would have been available in public settings. You could go up to a kiosk and buy them. And the advertising campaigns were enormous. If you walked around the cities in places like Moscow, the entirety of an outside of a building might be covered in a poster. You know, it looks like a mural advertising for Avtodor. And so what's fascinating is you have that end of the spectrum, and then you have the thing the size of your phone, right? This sort of multi-pronged attack of visual materials. And so this society was meant to facilitate the development of automobilism and improving roads in the Russian Soviet, well, the Russian part of the USSR. And so what they're talking about is just building socialism in general, but also the new Soviet person. So the images themselves have a total language to see. The colors are important. The fact that the central figures are in red shows that they are ideologically acceptable people. Because everybody who is a hero in this context always wears red somewhere. They'll have a red scarf. In this case, they just painted them red. But you also see the symbiotic relationship between the idealized worker and the idealized peasant, both of them grasping the future that's associated with learning how to drive. And they don't just mean cars, right? Like, yeah, you have a car, but you also have that handy truck and, of course, a tractor. And there's a wonderful line in a film from the 1930s called Tractor Drivers, where the hero says, you know, anyone who can drive a tractor can drive a tank. because this came out right as they were going into World War II. And so this idea that learning how to drive was a skill that could benefit you in so many different ways was really pivotal. And that's very much expressed in this image, right? Where these are ordinary people. These are not stylized figures. This is meant to be any peasant or any worker you could see in a normal everyday context, but gaining this skill that's associated with modernity. You have in the background, of course, images that, we read them live very differently. The belching smokestacks, for instance, are always a sign of progress, not pollution. It's about, we're shifting over into industrial production. We're going to catch up and overtake the West. This is really important. If you look at the way in which they're always moving forward on the road, this image that we're moving forward, we are going to have progress, and the road itself becomes a symbol for the Soviet state and what the government is trying to embrace. On top of that, the great thing about places like Avtodor is it gave people something to do in their leisure hours that was socially acceptable. And the Soviet state from the late 1920s all the way through the 1930s was really worried about what people did when they were not at work. And they specifically wanted people to drink less and stop going to church. So there were very deep concerns that when people drank too much, they got into fights. Then on Monday morning, their productivity was really bad, or they got really drunk and they beat people up and they got hurt, and that life expectancy wasn't great. And of course, church going was really bad, because church officials might tell you something, or your loyalty might not be to the goals of the state if, for instance, a religious official gave you a counter goal. So providing alternative forms of leisure was crucial to the early Soviet state. And they developed programs like this for every age group and seemingly every category. And this is what Avtodor is going to do. They're offering an alternative. And many of these are really attractive to young people. You can imagine, do you want to go and listen to a church service on Sunday? Or do you want to hop in a car and drive around and impress your friends? You see the attraction. But this spirit of civic mindedness also meant if you joined one of these organizations, you participated in a new kind of collective. You became part of Soviet society in a different way. You became more technologically literate, but you also became a kind of new person, and you bought into what the state was trying to do. So this is Avtodor. The other thing, too, is as Avtodor began to have races in various parts of the Soviet Union, they went really far out in a lot of places, and the stories of what would happen on the rallies is very much nightmarish. We ran out of gas, we blew 3 tires. They were really in primitive areas, but it became lionized as, look how heroic our drivers are. They can overcome any challenges. But the goal of those trips was to also introduce these technologies to the periphery, right? So just as Lenin had campaigns about electrification, you also have this idea. Imagine the first time a car shows up in a village, and the people are saying, yeah, come for a ride with us. In the future, we will have this world. It becomes more tangible. Can you just flip to the last slide for me, please? Thank you. And then we have Asoaviachim. Which is an acronym that I love saying because it terrorizes my students. They're all like, do we need to know how to spell that? And the answer is they can't. So this is the Society for Aid to Defense, Aviation, and the Chemical Industry, and it was founded in 1927. It did a ton of civil defense. It taught people how to wear a gas mask, taught them how to deal with attacks from chemical warfare, but it taught them a whole bunch of other defense-related things. And it was very much tied to campaigns encouraging people to learn how to shoot rifles. Eventually there are sharpshooter badges for that, as well as jump out of planes, parachute jumping in general, all of these kinds of things. Again, if you're a young person, really cool, right? That you can go and these facilities are provided and this is what you can do on the weekend. Jump out of planes? Like, who thought that was possible? But the important thing here, again, no funding from the state. So Asoaviachim is relying on things like the sale of lottery tickets to fund its activities. It did run courses for pilot training, sharpshooting, and parachute jumping. One of the interesting things is any of you who know anything about World War II will remember that, of course, on the first day of the war, so many Soviet planes were destroyed. The Soviet Union in 1941 had more trained pilots than they had planes. because so many people had done training through these kinds of places. But this lottery ticket is just such a phenomenal piece of art, for lack of a better word. It literally, the original is the size of my phone. And you have, of course, the hammer and sickle, the stylized, again, connection in the society. But look at the imagining of the world, right? We're going to create an industrial paradise, and we can defend it with modern technologies like airplanes. They didn't have planes that looked like that. They were flying around in Wright brother planes with fabric wings and wooden frames. But that's not what they were saying. They were saying this is what our future could be. And we are going to be a modern state where, again, the lower classes are part of this, and look at all the opportunity that we have. They were very much emphasizing a positive message, and it was permeating absolutely every piece of paper that they could find. Thank you very much. And the last slide says thank you. I can't fix that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alison. Let me see if I can fix this.
Yeah, sorry.
All right. So, Alexis, you're just going to have to carry this around. Alexis Peri is our next speaker. She's the author of The War Within, Diaries from the Siege of Leningrad, which won the Pushkin House Book Prize and was listed by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 10 best books on the Soviet home front. She recently completed Dear Unknown Friend, the remarkable correspondence between American and Soviet women. She received her PhD at UC Berkeley and is currently Associate Professor of History at Boston University. Her talk is War and I, How Artists and Diarists Witnessed the Leningrad Blockade Differently. Alexis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I must first met, can I see if I put this down? I don't know if I can walk and talk and chew gum at the same time. Oh, okay. Does that work? Maybe that? Is that okay? All right. Oh, terrific. Excellent. I had the good fortune of first meeting Julie and getting to know the Blavatnik Archive in 2012 when I was at Middlebury College, ever so briefly, but which was wonderful, and luckily long enough there to meet you. And then we met again in 2017 when I was working on veterans from the Second World War and used your collections. And now it's just a delight to be here and reunited with you. I really wish I had known about this collection when I was working on the siege, but better late than never, and I get to talk about it today. So let's see. Oh, great. So one of the many gems of the Blavatnik Archive is this collection of 1,330 postcards. I think about 630 unique postcards that were made and published in besieged Leningrad, which is an incredible feat considering the state of the city of utter devastation at the time. And the postcards provide these new pictures and perspectives on the Leningrad blockade, of course, one of the longest sieges since biblical times and one of the most horrific events of the Second World War. I started working on the blockade in 2004, and then when I had the good fortune to see these postcards, which the Blavatnik Archive is making publicly available, or has made publicly available to scholars, I began to see the sources that I had read in a whole new light. I had been focusing on diaries from the Siege of Leningrad, and when I looked at these postcards, I got this new appreciation for what Leningraders would have seen, as well as what they read in newspapers and what they experienced. Okay, I have lots of slides, so hopefully we can make this work. Just as a reminder, Leningrad was the centerpiece of the longest land battle of the Second World War, and also an 872-day siege, which lasted from September 41 to January 44. It was one of the most deadly sieges in history, taking more than 40% of the pre-war population of the city, somewhere estimated around 900,000 people. This is important to keep into perspective. Some people estimate this is the greatest number of deaths in any single city from any single event in history. Another way to understand this is that the number of people who died in Leningrad during the siege was greater than the number of American military who died in all wars between 1776 and 1976. Just as a reminder of what took place, the city was surrounded by German and Finnish troops and then bombarded heavily in the summer of 1941. cutting off Leningrad, eventually severing Leningrad's railway connections to the rest of the Soviet Union, and cutting off the city almost entirely, except for its heavily patrolled water passage through Lake Ladoga. The bombing of the city in September 41 was intense, up to 18 hours at a time, with the goal of erasing St. Petersburg from the face of the earth. But the bombardment only took a small portion of the enormous casualties. The vast majority of people, of course, in Leningrad died from starvation. As rations plummeted, of course, the city was cut off from supply, and rations plummeted to just 125 grams for most people, of bread for most people, and often less than that. So the blockade, should I just ask for a slide? Is that a better way to do it? Then, okay, I will do that. Thank you so much. So the blockade engendered this crushing sense of remoteness, described by Leningraders as an island, or here as a ring, and you can see a child's rendering of this. Next slide, please. It engendered this anguish of starvation. People became estranged from their bodies, from their gender, from their age, unrecognizable to themselves in the mirror. Next slide, please. It defamiliarized the most intimate of spaces, people's homes, and very recognizable landmark. Next slide, please. You can see here, these are also some postcards featured in the collection, this protection of the statue of Peter the Great. This profound disorientation, next slide, please, where people became unmoored from their previous identities, their jobs, their relationships, their families, as well as unmoored from their sense of time, past, present, and future. Some diarists describe the siege as a kind of time machine that plunged Leningraders back into the past. Next slide, please. Unmoored from their physical appearance, from language, from their sense of distance, near and far, and so forth. And so trying to understand this, the letters and the diaries, and the postcards and diaries provide these two really interesting and different ways to document how people tried to make sense of this ordeal. People who were trapped inside this ring, and as well as for people outside of it. Next slide, please. Both postcards and diaries functioned as a kind of lifeline. That is to say, they were a way for Blavatniki, including those who were designing postcards and drawing them, as well as diarists, ways for these Blavatniki to overcome the torpidity of isolation by helping them connect and cope and articulate with trauma. Next slide, please. All right. And recognizing the importance of these connections of writing, the Soviet Union delivered an estimated 70 million letters per month during the war. And inside Leningrad, we have the production of, what is it, Olga, about 800 different postcards, more than 600 of which are part of this collection. And of course, Leningrad party authorities also encouraged diary writing. We have several hundred diaries, and we also have memoirs that were recorded during and immediately after the siege. Next slide, please. So I became fascinated thinking about how these two different narrative modes, postcards and diaries, are related. And in some ways, they are very similar. They're kind of the writing of everyday matters, the mundane. They can be considered both private and public. They can be read as one-offs or serially. And often diaries, which I read, contained letters, and vice versa. A series of letters often took on the quality of reading like a diary with various installments. Next slide, please. But in some ways, the postcards and the diaries align very closely, talking about some similar issues. But in other fascinating ways, they really diverge. And that's what I wanted to talk about with my remaining time, are some of the ways we see diaries and postcards converge and diverge when trying to capture this indescribable experience. So I'll just show a couple of examples. Next slide, please. Sorry, you can skip ahead to the next one as well. Thank you. All right, so the times when the diaries and the postcards are most similar, when they align the most, is at the very start of the war and at the very end. And during these moments, when the geopolitical and military events were evolving really rapidly, what you see is that diarists tend to follow official newspapers and radio broadcasts very closely. They cut out articles and put them in their diaries. They replicate the same motifs that they encounter in the media, in postcards, for example, this one here, or in the newspapers. And I give you just one quote from Eliana Muchana, really kind of parroting a slogan about victory being the Soviet people's. They'll do anything to save humanity from tyranny. Next slide, please. Or some examples like this, where you can see the kind of connection between what's visually being represented and what people are writing in their own private notebooks. Give you two quotations here, but I love the one from Yura Ryabinkin, who was 16 at the time, really classically framing the war as an ideological battle, right? Two opposing systems, socialism and fascism, have clashed. The welfare of all mankind hangs on the outcome of this battle. Often early diary entries really read this way, and you can see a lot of connection, replicating of discourse, etc. Next slide, please. Where they start to diverge is when you have increased intensification of bombardment, for example. Bombardment took an estimated 2% of civilian deaths, but it was so deadly because it obliterated the supplies of food within the city, which caused the vast majority of deaths from starvation. Here's just one quotation here from an actor, Fyodor Nikitin. On the street, interspersed with explosions, one could hear true human pain. We're not prepared for war. We have nothing to fight with, no planes, no equipment. Where is this war with few losses on foreign territory? Or are we betrayed? These conversations are frightening. And here you can even see, as he's recording these street utterances, he kind of takes this newspeak, right? War with few losses on foreign territory. Next slide, please. No worries. No problem. And over time, you see this strong divergence in the motifs of postcards and the newspapers, which remain so central, and on the other hand, what Leningraders are taking from newspapers and postcards in order to make sense. The landscape, the information landscape of blockaded Leningrad was really fascinating. On the one hand, there was this plethora of information and visual representations of the war, not just the hundreds of postcards, but the newspaper Leningradskaya Pravda was published every single day except for one. The radio was broadcast every day with only a brief hiatus for a couple weeks in the winter of 1941-42. But at the same time, Leningraders felt acutely that while they were getting all this information, they were clearly being deprived of other kinds of information. News reports were very sparse. For example, the Soviet Information Bureau, which was in charge of deciding what information could be disseminated and what couldn't, excluded Leningrad from 75% of broadcasts, radio broadcasts that were reaching Moscow. So Leningraders were sort of kept without substantial news in many ways, while they were also receiving regular newspapers, broadcasts, postcards, posters, and other sources of information. So next slide, please. So what I found fascinating was thinking about what would the diarists have seen, for example, using these postcards or encountering them compared to what they wrote. This is one quotation from a diarist and historian, Georgy Knyazev, talking about the news summaries and how cryptic they were. He says, short lines of the summary. Over the course of August 14th, our troops carried out fierce battles against the enemy on all fronts. And you can sort of see this sort of visually represented here. What do these stingy lines mean? An offensive? Whose? Ours? The Germans? Usually? I have lost any orientation on current events. Next slide, please. And diarists like Knyazev worked to disambiguate these stock phrases like fighting continues on all fronts and nothing of substance has occurred, which was very often how the news read. Even good news could be very alarming because the diarists assumed it was a mask for something else. This is 11-year-old Dima Afanasyev seeing with this postcard and what he may have encountered. It really brought this home to me. He says, quote, why are they always honoring pilots above everything else? Clearly, we are fighting more poorly on the ground than in the air. So these kinds of slogans like, all for the front, we live only to work and think about victory, cast Leningraders as citizen soldiers. Next slide, please. And the postcards do this very effectively, but the diarists became weary of this sort of heroic defender rhetoric because in part it de-emphasized their suffering and didn't ring true with their own experience. This is a party worker at an electrical plant describing a reaction to an article by Ilya Ehrenburg. And she says, quote, "Like every other newspaper article, it rings out on too high of a note. Something from that article reached me, forced me to take a good look around and with merciless clarity to verify that all of us, even residents of the front city, live by our own interests, our own routines and habits, our self-preservation, and very little by the military front. That is what we lack," she says, purposefulness. Next slide, please. And of course, on the subject of starvation, you see pretty dramatic divergence as well. There were postcards about food. These were the two I could find. I think the only two, yeah? Or that we know of. Oh, there's one more. Oh, darn, there's one more. But like these postcards, they really downplay the seriousness of the starvation, the famine that was taking place in the city. They are designed to boost morale, so you can see here the planting of a victory garden, for example. And the newspapers themselves were full of veiled language about hunger. Usually ration updates were published on the last page at the bottom right corner in tiny print. But on the other hand, next slide, please. In the center of Leningradskaya Pravda, there were tons of articles about hunger in other places, particularly in Germany. There was even articles about how Germany's rat population was starving. And imagine if you're a person starving in a city reading about starving rats. Yeah? And you can see some of these motifs about how Germans were suffering so extensively from starvation on the postcards as well. Next slide, please. But of course, what wasn't discussed and not captured in the postcards was the dramatic emaciation and transformation of most people inside the city, who had not only become blokadniki, but had become dystrofiki. Next slide, please. Dystrophic was a term used to refer to someone who is suffering from starvation, sort of medicalized term for it, which essentially became everyone. And just to sort of hit home about these two different realities, the one presented by postcards and the media and the other presented in diaries, I give you one more quote, also from a party member, describing in reaction to Fadiev's article, What I Saw in Leningrad. He said, "There were a million things that were not reflected upon, which can be seen in the streets of Leningrad in the dark nights and frosty winter days, dozens of bodies on the streets." Next slide, please. And in fact, can you do click ahead? Thank you. In fact, the very watchwords of the siege experience were not used in the press. The word blokada, asada, for example, blokadnik, dystrophic, these are terms that don't appear in any headline in Leningradskaya Pravda until the siege was punctured in 1943. Instead, the press and the postcards preferred other motifs like battle or defense or fortress, which applied a much more active resistance on the part of Leningrad rather than themes of starvation, confinement, or deprivation. Next slide, please. And lastly, I just want to talk a bit about the function of letters and postcards, how we see them through the Blavatnik collection and how we see them through diaries. The function of letters and postcards became clear to me from my work, and especially from seeing this collection, could be comforting, but also very unsettling. Next slide, please. Many of the postcards in the Blavatnik collection show families reading together or writing letters to each other, and they make very clear the way that epistolary binds helped keep people together, helped keep families together. Next slide, please. And I also really found this to be true. Numerous diarists who I studied talked about sending and receiving letters to family members who were outside the ring, who were not in Leningrad, and how inspiring that was, and how those people outside and that prospect of reuniting with them was their motivation to live, their very source of strength, what kept them going. Next slide, please. However, this conceals a great deal about a much darker truth, and that is that families who were together inside the ring, inside besieged Leningrad, were often torn apart by the stress and the difficulty of eating together and sharing food, and having to figure out how food should get divided and who should get what. Diary after diary shows, with families inside the ring, the separation between husbands and wives, parents and children. And often children sometimes would be abandoned by their parents, or some would opt to go to orphanages where they knew they'd be fed regularly. There's also the family emerges this way, with this quotation as being an example, the kind of glee when someone from the family dies, not only because there are fewer mouths to feed, but also because the ration cards would revert to the family for as long as that card was functional, so it had to be renewed. So here's a quotation recorded by Arkady Lepkovich with his 7-year-old niece, Musya, and she basically explains why she's happy that her mother has died. Next slide, please. Also with this contrast was the diaries of people like Alexandra Mironova, who was a history teacher but began to work for the Commission on the Protection of Children. Her job was to find abandoned children and bring them to orphanages and detention centers. She writes, "How many have begun to abandon their children? It's horrible that mothers themselves leave their children. In February, 9 individuals ranging from 1.5 to 3 years old can't explain what happened to mama, right? But they wait for mama and believe she is alive." Next slide, please. So what the postcards reveal, but also conceal, is that the configuration of the family is really what mattered. Proximity created emotional distance and tension and strife, whereas geographical distance between family members, bolstered by memory and longing, created this sense of emotional closeness. Next slide, please. I don't know if I have time for one last example. Okay, great, thank you. I just want to tell you very briefly about the diary of engineer Geisel Girfer. He's somebody who continually grew an affection for his wife and his daughter Mulya, who had evacuated to Gorky, while he, in the city of Leningrad, lived with Tanya and had a very turbulent relationship. Now, he never explains how he's related to Tanya, which I think is telling, though he says Tanya is his very closest relation. He talks instead about how much he dreamt of reuniting with his daughter and his wife, whereas he was so strained by living with Tanya. He described their relationship as torturous. Please click ahead. As a terrible burden because the two of them had to decide how to share food. And in fact, Tanya worked at a hospital, got a lot of extra rations, and it's very clear from the diary that she is sharing the bulk of her food with him. But that's never what he sees. He only talks about how difficult it is for them to get along. He describes her as an egoist, for example, and talks about how they have to actually sleep in separate locations because the animosity between them is so great. Meanwhile, the whole time he's focused on sending food and parcels of food and money to Gorky for his daughter and his wife. So he's struggling to get food so he can send it out of the city, but he's also struggling against his relative about how to share food within the city. Please click ahead. Every time he eats something himself, he describes himself as swinish, or that he's committing a crime against his wife, for example. Can you click ahead one more time? He says, "I live only for them, and if they were not there, then it would not be worth living at all." Sorry, I see that there's a typo. And a few months later, when he is able to go out of the city for a business task, he defects, essentially. He never returns to Leningrad, and someone else, probably Tanya, handed over his diary to the party archive in 1945. Do you mind clicking ahead? So I think postcards and diaries illuminate more together than they do separately. They show hope and imagination, omission and fantasy, consistent, inspiring messaging, as well as the kind of linguistic failures induced by indescribable trauma. All of these things, all of these images, all of these things populated besieged Leningrad. And whether they were comforting or disquieting, the postcards, as well as the press and official media, circulated before the eyes of the Blavatniki. And I think maybe what's most interesting to me, though I won't comment on this further at this moment, is the way that the images from the postcards rather than the quotations and experiences from the diaries, have so strongly colored the memory and the legacy of the blockade today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexis. It is my sad duty to report that Stephen Norris, unfortunately, has taken ill, and in his place, we will have a presentation by our own Julie Chervinsky, who will highlight some of our holdings in a talk entitled Red Army Soldiers in World War II, Propaganda Images and Veteran Interviews.
I'll start by saying, please come next time, the clicker will work better. Thank you, Brandon, for introducing. I'm so sorry again that Steve is not here. I hope he feels better. If you could please put on the, wonderful. And the next slide, please. Official imagery. Basically, I'm going to start with just like, what are the biggest images that the Soviet Union put out there about the war, and sort of the biggest symbols out there, or the symbolic that we've grown used to seeing. Official imagery of World War II presented the conflict as a unified, collective effort by patriotic heroes in an epic existential struggle. Let's look at some of these images a little more closely but briefly. Next slide, please. This one is literally called Motherland Calls. We see, based on this postcard, the artist is Sergei Tolkachev, printed in 1941 in the beginning of the war. There's faceless masses in the bottom of the section over here. You literally cannot see their faces. Everyone looks exactly the same. They have no faces. They are just identical shapes, can't tell individual people apart. There are numerous tanks and aircrafts conveying that it's a massive fight. The soldier is larger than life. The idea is that the military service is elevating people to giant status, also emphasizing the epic scale of the war. The motherland on the top appeal to patriotism, literally saying motherland is calling, and the red banner, symbol of communism, emphasizing the unity of the people and the party and the military. Let's look at the next image, please. Thank you. This one is Defenders of Leningrad, postcard by artist Vladimir Serov, one of the central figures in socialist realism, the dominant genre of Soviet art. This is one of the iconic images of the wars. Let us defend the city of Lenin, produced as a poster and a postcard in 1941. In it, he depicts a soldier, a sailor, an older worker, and a young woman. The four residents of Leningrad are shown standing together in the same pose with the same expression. It looks like they actually have the exact same face. And behind them are various landmarks that pull the city itself into the story as well. The factory smokestacks, joint imperial landmarks, sort of bringing the time, the history, and the present together, the Admiralty and St. Isaac's Cathedral. The city and its people are all together, again stressing the unity of the effort and erasing individuality by design. One more. Victory. This one is 1945. Prominent artist is Boris Yefimov, who unfortunately, Professor Norris was going to speak a lot more about today. The Red Army soldier, a generic model, here is planting a flag into the Reichstag, which was the German parliament building, not used by this time after 1933 fire, but still very much a symbol. The black forces of Nazi Germany, they're literally colored black, defeated by the Red Army. Notably, the soldier himself is not just generic looking, but also he doesn't even get his own outfit, he's just colored red. And again, stressing unity and sameness in extreme and absolute degree. To a large degree, these images dominate the visual story of the war and the soldiers who fought it. Next slide, please. It is a story that employs a flat, heroic narrative, erasing individual experience in all its richness, from the tragic to the unexpectedly hilarious. What we did, we met war's veterans and asked them to share their stories. However affected by the passage of time and the imperfections of human memory, we tried to restore some of that experience and offer a variety of more personal, nuanced, and often surprising perspectives. And I'm going to share a few of these stories with you now, kind of beyond the nameless to go into actual faces and names and people and experiences. So if we, let's see how this works. If we go to the next one, please. This is Buddy Stumbler, sorry. Along with the faceless masses of those who were fighting, the other faceless were all those who were dying. And so Buddy Stumbler, we met him in Moscow, and I wanted to share this story about casualties. If you could press the next, and then on the bottom there's a play thing. Let's see. Or I might have to just go do this from the back there. Yeah.
Я никогда не забуду первую жертву. Сейчас я вам расскажу. Мы вошли в одну деревню. Ну, а деревне там мало что осталось. Были выкопаны эти самые щели, бомбоубежища, деревенские выкопаны. Мы вошли в деревню, и вдруг начали нас бомбить. Налетели немецкие самолеты. Много самолетов немецких начали бомбить нас. Ну, кто успел залететь в щель, а кто не успел. И вот я помню фамилию и имя этого мальчика, этого курсанта, с которым я учился вместе в военном училище. Юра Рогов. Он получил множественные осколочные ранения, и он на руках у меня умер. И вот эти безымянные могилы, мы потом, когда двинулись дальше, когда пошли дальше, его закопали, сделали холмик, безымянный совершенно холмик. Юра Рогов, понимаете? Да что говорить, вспоминать все это очень тяжело. Мальчишками были.
We can go to the next one. Arkady Dayel. Lived experience, told of combat. What was the first experience of a young soldier on a battlefield? We interviewed Arkady in Israel. Please, if you could, go to the next slide and then go to the bottom and play.
Я стреляю и не вижу, в кого стреляю. Спрятал голову за камень. Он на меня вытащил пистолет, стреляет, ну и ругается. А мне кажется, что пули летят все только в мою сторону, а стреляли трассирующими пулями. Часто говорили, ну, на войне привыкает к пулям, привыкает к снарядам. Человек ко всему привыкает, но я бы сказал, это довольно дурная привычка. Кланялся, не строил из себя никакого героя. Трусит? Нет, не трусит. Но когда над правым, над левым ухом, над головой свистят пули, уже чисто по-человечески, я мальчишка, мне еще 18 лет не было, конечно, стараюсь где-то укрыться. Думаю, что все пули летят только в твою сторону.
Again, just the idea of everybody's forward, this mass, and then there's the individual experience of what it actually means to go into the battle. If we could go to the next one, you were only supposed to think about saving people, attacking people, saving your soldiers, and I wanted to share this story. Asma Ginzina, we met her in Brooklyn. Please. Yeah, on the bottom, just. The next slide, maybe it's on the next one on the bottom. Just go to the next one. And then on the
А потом в 42 феврале нас через Волгу переправили, я попала в Сталинградскую битву. Там я была сам инструктором, медсестрой. Мы вытаскивали раненых после поля боя. И в этом бою был подбит танк. И я шла сам инструктором. И я подошла с ним, а там, говорит, в танке, он говорит, там, говорит, покойник, он весь обгоревший. И что-то я ему не поверила. Я подошла, пощупала, его пульс бьется. Это был мой будущий муж. Мы его вытащили. Я его до блиндажа 12 километров тащили, привязали к носилке, вот так вот. По дороге мне осколком перебило пальцы. Я его одной рукой дотащила, потом сама попала в госпиталь. Он полгода лежал, у него брали с ягодицы мясо, клеили живот. Он сказал, жив буду, я тебя найду. 2 года искала, вид. И вот мы поженились в 1948 году.
And actually, if you can go to the next slide. That's them. That's the couple. They went on to have 8 kids. They adopted also her brother's kid because he died in the war. She came to the interview carrying a portrait of herself. I wanted to play this because it's sort of not what you think about war is this is a good dating place, or at least not today. It was naturally, or like, where am I going to meet, my future husband? And there it was. And if we could go to the last one, to the next one. There's Olga came up with, and what, because then there are the moments when we struggle actually of how do we help people find this, because this is nothing that one would think of looking for, and yet this is life at the front. So please, next slide, and we got this.
Ну а дальше по Белоруссии, здесь что запомнилось? Запомнилось, конечно, хорошее, да. Было всякое, было и нехорошее, в том смысле, что нехорошее, и голодно было, и взрывались, и ребята погибали. Но запомнилось хорошее. А что запомнилось? Значит, нас предупреждали. Немцы уходят и травят, все травят. Оставляют мины, причем всякие, даже не видно какая-то мина, а это оказалась мина, и травят, колодцы, не пейте. И вот мы входим в одно село, в котором, выясняется, был молокозавод. Мы заходим на этот молокозавод, какие-то там бараки были, что, и там стоят чаны со сметаной. Со сметаной. Там же говорят, что травят все. А сметана? Нам же старшины не приносили сметаны, да? Попробуйте. Это мы смотрим на пробовальщика. Тогда ладошки. Опять живой. Кашкой. Живой. Ну, короче говоря, все эти чаны со сметаной разбираются. Мы становимся в оборону. И на брусверах окопов стоят котелки и каски со сметаной. Ну куда-то, не под ноги, положишь. Наверх, да? А утром артнарет. И так как мы с вами сейчас сидим, только и поближе, вплотную коленками, я сижу с командиром огневого взвода артиллеристов 45-го. Где-то взрывается, и после одного из такого взрыва осколки, и весь мой Ванюшка в сметане. У него на брусвере в сметане. И смех, и смеешься, и страшно. Вот такая вот запомнилась такая картинка.
We have so many of these amazing stories. We're really excited to share them with you, to share the holdings. We're really grateful that you came. And Brandon now will ask some questions.
All right. Can we make the second mic live for the audience, who will have a chance to interrogate our panelists in just a moment, but I will be taking my privilege as I'll basically be hijacking my privilege as the moderator to ask each of the panelists a question, and then we can collect some questions and everybody can come up and kind of answer what's been asked. So my question for Samuel is, I would really like to hear more about the future traces and the relationship that you see between these kind of colorization processes in the 20s and 30s and this kind of avant-garde move in the late and post-Soviet period. For Alison, I have a raft of questions. I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit more on just the weirdness of gambling under socialism, because that's essentially what's going on here, right? We have lotteries are kind of a regressive tax. We have, how are you supposed to just win something not through your labor in a socialist society? And, do they investigate the class backgrounds of the people who win? So all questions that you have a chance to talk about in a second. For Alexis, in your first book, the kind of dissonance between what happens in the diaries and the kind of established myth of the war is one of the fundamental tensions. And you've alluded towards the end of your talk that the postcards are in some ways a major source for some of these myths. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about myths that appear or do not appear in the postcards that kind of emerge in this wartime and even more so post-war mythologization of the Siege of Leningrad. And then for Julie, you interviewed these veterans in a wide variety, was it 11 different countries, if I remember correctly, something like that? Are there any sort of geographical trends for how they narrate the war differently? Do you get a different story in Israel, in Brighton Beach, in Moscow, in Ukraine, or does that seem to be kind of not a major impact on how these folks are narrating their experiences? With that, I also want to open it up to the audience for anyone who'd like to ask a question. I will bring you the microphone, and please just make sure you identify who your question is for. So do we have any takers in the audience at the moment? Clearly either was, All right, then in that case, I'm going to turn things over, same order that people presented in. If you do have questions, wave at me and I will find you after they're done answering my questions.
Thank you, Brandon, for the question. So I think the idea of the future traces for me is incredibly important for a lot of different reasons. When you look at the work of the photographer Boris Mikhailov, quite often, and essentially in almost everything let's maybe not be so overreaching, but in most of things that have been written about him, and especially his work with luriki, which, these aniline dyes, is seen as kind of like a mocking gesture, essentially making fun of the everyday Soviet in this post-Stalinist landscape. The way that I see it instead actually is about a trying to come to terms with the splintering self. So following the death of Stalin, following the thaw, getting into Brezhnev, Mikhailov is essentially both dealing with his internal identity as well as the external. So it's impossible for him to be able to remove himself from where he is, right? And so I see a lot of these bringing together of text, especially with luriki, it's a lot of found photographs. The same thing with some of the sotsart that he does later, but there's a mixture between him taking the photographs himself and repurposing some, as well as painting on these. And the way that I see it is essentially trying to come to terms with this past that is still there, but is completely ossified, and trying to figure out where the movement forward is going to come from, because it apparently, as we see it, it comes from the internal. And by both looking back, but also understanding that things can't be the same, and there's no reason to wish that they are going to be the same. Thank you.
These microphones are designed for taller people. We'll just kind of, yeah. All right, we'll just shout into it from a distance. The lotteries are kind of an odd thing. Brandon is absolutely right in this, that it doesn't make sense. In 1903, Lenin wrote exactly that lotteries were a regressive tax on the lower classes. And what changed was the famine in the early 1920s, which many of you probably know about, I hope you do. And so the early Soviet state during the Civil War faced tremendous famine. And I mean, this is a famine where they were so desperate they invited help from the Americans, from the Quakers, from everybody. There was a papal bull that encouraged people to donate. I mean, at that point, the Soviet state was accepting help from every ideological enemy it could find. It also reintroduced lotteries. as a way of getting money to feed the starving. At the same time, they introduced semi-postals that you could purchase to put on your mail, and the money from those sales also went to the starving. And I think they realized this was a way to make money. And then the shift comes, the images that I'm showing you becomes more about a society emphasizing consumption and the benefits that socialism are going to bring to everyday life. Now, the interesting thing, I would try to conceptualize this as the perfect example to give you. And, to go a little pop culture. Home and Garden Television has a show called My Lottery Dream Home, all right? Where lottery winners are taken by a host with really bad tattoos everywhere. I'm sorry, to go and buy a new home after they win. The people who watch that show probably buy tickets, probably know they're never gonna win, but they see ordinary other people who did. So those lottery tickets, usually the prizes were goods that were in scarce supply. And so what people knew, and as the media covered the winners, and they put pictures in the newspaper, people saw ordinary people who got stuff that was unavailable. But the fact that someone got that meant somebody somewhere in the country had access to scarce goods. And you could believe that tomorrow that could be you. So it seems contradictory, doesn't it? That they're putting on scarce goods as prizes. But people then can believe that someday these will be plentiful. And our state is moving towards that because, look, they at least have enough to give out for the prizes. And that's what made them very, very successful. There's no sense they checked the winners for their backgrounds or anything like that. These lotteries die out by the mid-1930s. The Aso Aviahim stuff lasts longer. Most of the postcards that advertise Aso Aviahim lotteries, actually the ones I collected, were all mailed to Germany, which I find really funny. That, of these images of tanks and planes, and everyone, when they mail them, it's going on international mail, as if you're sending a message about the Soviet defense capabilities. But this phenomenon dies out, only to be revived. There's a new wave of lotteries under Khrushchev. And again, it's quite different. But again, the big prizes are always things that are in short supply, but the state is promising them. Cars, fur coats, all of this kind of stuff. And so the promise is always there. The problem is the reality is a little different. But that is often the case in Soviet propaganda. So thank you for the great question.
Ooh, it's a good question, Brandon. What's interesting, I think, is that how much the postcards do represent the major tropes of the sort of myth of the Siege of Leningrad, or the Leningrad's legacy. And it makes sense in the way that that narrative, that master narrative of the siege, is being crafted during the war. So you see it in the iconic texts that are written, and you see it in these images as well. Certainly, after the war is over, the siege is lifted, there is much more open discussion about starvation. There's a much more open discussion of things that don't get well depicted in postcards, like the inside of hospitals, wounded soldiers, people who are civilians who have been wounded. But nonetheless, I think the tropes remain pretty similar and pretty tight. And so when I first saw these postcards, that really helped me make a lot of sense of this, is that, postcards are not just, of course, a letter, it's also a souvenir and a way of remembering. And if, insofar as folks had these postcards in their collections, this is what begins to color their memory, and in some cases edge out some of those other reactions and experiences that the raw runs that they had at the time.
Very quick. I probably, I didn't do a study on this in any way, so I don't want to misrepresent. I can say maybe there's just two moments that stood out to me. One was, for example, in Kiev. When we interviewed in Kiev, everybody talked about Babi Yar, and it was a much more, not just like a mention, it was something that was in some way more real, even including people who are originally from Kiev but interviewed in Israel. It was just sort of a different focus. But really the biggest, I would say, impact is whatever country they were in, they were grateful to that country for having them, for hosting them, saying, you know, America's great because now we're in America. Israel's great because now we're in Israel. I don't know how much I can say to tainting their memory, but it was that personal now experience. That's all.
All right, one more thing stands between you and the bar. Before we thank all of our panelists one last time, I want to remind you that this is part of a year-long program. We will be doing the same thing, same place, May 15th, on a panel called Individual Experience of the Second World War, which will include presentations by Oleg Budnitsky, Jochen Helbeck, Polina Barskova, and myself. And then on September 25th, same time, same place, we'll have a panel, Images of Jewish Culture in Times of Crisis, which will include presentations by Elisa Ben-Porad, Amber Nickel, Vasily Shadrin, and Anna Stanchis. And our final event will be on Sunday, December 7th, with details to follow because we plan on making it a more massive scale event. So thank you all very much for coming. We have a little bit more socialization to do. And please thank our panelists before you are free.
Where'd it go?
I got an R6 Mark II. I just bought it.
Oh, that's a really good camera. That's a really good camera.
Oh, it was a birthday present to myself.
Yeah, good for you. You deserved it.
Thank you.
I was torn between going for that or I got the R5, but I just wanted, for my work, any extra megapixel helps. But it is overkill.
I was coming from the ADD. So.
Yeah, I was coming from 5D4, and this camera, I told my wife I might be leaving you, Liz, because I've fallen in love with my camera. This camera's so good. Even I can't screw it up.
All right.